right, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time late in the semester to join us for the final talk in 2017, organized by the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, which is, for those who don't know, one of six, I believe now, centers under the auspices of the Institute of East Asian Studies. My name is Sanjot Mehendale. I'm the chair of the Tang Center. For those who are here for the first time, I would like to apologize for the pillars. When the Institute of East Asian Studies lost its office space on Fulton Street, we were relocated off campus to 1995 University, and to retain some academic visibility for our program, we were provided with this space. And for those of you who are long-time Berkeley faculty or affiliates, this used to be a reading room, and I believe before that it was the microfiche room, because when I was a graduate student here, this is where you went to get old newspapers and old documents, or read old documents. Again, for those who may be here for the first time, the P.Y. and Kinmei W. Tang Center for Silk Road Studies was founded only recently in spring of 2017 to advance research and teaching on the trading networks commonly referred to as the Silk Roads. Now, for this year, 2017-2018, our annual theme is the Maritime Silk Road. And this fall, we've already had talks on maritime Buddhism, on the movement of glass products in the early Common Era, and the importance of the Indian Ocean in the history of the Mongol Empire, respectively. In the spring semester, we just finalized our monthly lineup. We'll have talks by UC Irvine Professor Touraj Daryai on Sasanian and Persian maritime trade. UCLA Professor Li Min will be speaking on China and the Indian Ocean. And CBS postdoc Jack Chia, I'm not sure if he's here today, will be discussing 18th and 19th century Buddhism in Southeast Asia. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. Back to our speaker. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Derek Heng. I met Derek earlier this year at Columbia University, where he gave a talk in a conference. He gave a talk on the nature of China's maritime trade during the late Tang period. There were many reasons why it was a wonderful lecture, Derek, but I was particularly interested in his ideas regarding the spatial geography of maritime trade and exchanges. Derek is currently professor in and chair of the history department at Northwestern Arizona University, where he teaches courses on pre-modern Asia. He's also senior fellow at the Nalanda Sri Vijaya Center, where he's working on methods in integrating archaeological data from Southeast Asia with Chinese digital textual databases. Overall, his area of specialization is the economic and diplomatic history of maritime Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. His research is very multidisciplinary. He combines archaeological data with textual and epigraphic evidence, and not just from Southeast Asia, but also India and China. He's published a number of books. One is Sino-Malay Trade and Diplomacy in the 10th to 14th centuries. And he's also published quite a few works on the history of Singapore, where he hails from. Right? One is titled Singapore, a 700-Year History. His current research project focuses on the anatomy of port cities, and I think you're working on a publication, so it should be coming out soon. His talk today, entitled Trans-Regionalism and Economic Co-Dependency Across the South China Sea, explores the multifaceted nature of the economic interaction between China and the Malay region in the early second millennium of the Common Era. Please help me welcome Derek Heng.
So thank you, Sanjo, for a very, very generous introduction. and also to the Tang Center for this opportunity to give this talk today. It's always a privilege, I think, to have a community of scholars who are really interested in the maritime history of the South China Sea. The title of the talk that I'm giving today is Trans-Regionalism and Economic Co-Dependency in the South China Sea, and the case of China and the Malacca Straits region, or the Malay region in the 10th to 14th centuries. As we look at this map, one of the things that I think we can sort of see is that China and Southeast Asia are geographically located very, very close together. And a couple of things obviously developed over the course of centuries in terms of the economic interactive dynamics between these two regions. On the one hand, China very early on in the first millennium AD had developed sort of economic manufacturing capabilities, particularly in products such as ceramics, textiles, as well as metalware, that allowed it to sort of supersede many of the economic zones in the old world. The scale of the production, which was fairly phenomenal in terms of the volume that it could produce these sorts of products as well, placed it in a position where it was able to serve a function of actually providing these sorts of products that required sort of high technology, capabilities to regions that did not necessarily develop these sorts of technologies until pretty much later in the modern era. In Southeast Asia in particular, high-fire ceramics, for example, did not come into being until about the 10th or 11th centuries in Cambodia, and really only took off in a large scale in the 15th century. So ceramics, textiles, metalware were exported to Southeast Asia and, of course, the Malay region and the Malacca Straits region in large quantities throughout history, particularly from the end of the first millennium AD onwards. For Southeast Asia and the Malacca Straits region, given the nature of its natural products and the ecology, it was known very early on in the first millennium AD as a source of natural products that would be exported out into the rest of maritime Asia, particularly China. And so forest products, for example, resins, wood, and a whole series of different kinds of products were exported out of this region northwards into China by about the late first millennium AD. As we think about these sorts of economic relationships between Southeast Asia and China, one of the things that we have to bear in mind is the nature of the scholarship that has been developed over time. And this sort of world-famous Abu Lughod map of the different sectors of trade across the old world sort of encapsulates some of the current arguments, and that is that the two regions are pretty much distinct in their own right as economic zones, interacting really only in the interstate spaces, which are the port cities located by the arrows that are sort of pointing where they are. Let me see if I can get the cursor. There we go. So here, for example, Palembang, and obviously in the 15th century, Malacca, for example, in Southeast Asia. In the case of China, you have port cities like Guangzhou or Canton, Quanzhou or Zhejiang, for example, here in South Fujian. And these were primarily the interstate spaces where that interaction occurred. There has been relatively little arguments that actually look at this entire zone as a single economic region that is well integrated together in terms of vertical economic integration and economic codependency. So today's paper, I'm sort of trying to make an argument for a couple of things, one of which is that there was a shift in the nature of Sino-Southeast Asian economic relations through the course of the first half of the second millennium AD. Where in the 10th century, as we begin in the 10th century, Sino-Southeast Asian relations really looked like looked primarily as state-level exchanges between different trading partners in China at the state level, with China being a passive sort of trading partner. But by the 14th century, one of the things that manifests is an integrated trans-regional economic zone where you get vertical economic integration and economic codependency. There are four main questions that I'd like to sort of address today. The first one being, what enabled this economic integration to occur? The second question is, how did these changes affect the nature of Chinese exports to Southeast Asia? The third question being, how did Southeast Asia develop its exports in response to these changing economic situation? And finally, how did this integration affect Southeast Asian geopolitics? So to begin with, if we think about the advent of the Song period in 960 AD, what we do see is that China was a passive recipient of international trade. And by that, we were looking at state-level exchanges between foreign states, countries like Srivijaya, for example, Java, Abbasid dynasty in the Middle East, and so on and so forth, where foreign products were brought by the representatives of these states to the port cities in South China, primarily the port city of Guangzhou. One of the things that we can note from the textual material is that the range of products that were brought were actually quite narrow. And the reason for that was because these foreign trading partners that were arriving in the South Chinese ports were bringing products that they knew in the 10th century what the Chinese court was particularly interested in. And so they were addressing basically a demand market which was centered primarily in the Song court and the court officialdom of Song China. Almost all these products were Indian Ocean littoral products as well as Middle Eastern products. There was actually a very, very little Southeast Asian products that was involved in this trade at the beginning of the Song period. It's pretty much a follow-on of the Tang dynastic period trade that had occurred over the last sort of 2 or 3 centuries prior to the 10th century. For China's foreign trading partners, including states in the Malay region, in return for the products that they brought, Chinese products were given to them as reciprocal gifts. These gifts and the nature of these gifts was stipulated by court protocol under Song sort of court protocol rules, with very little sort of evidence of an extension of the taste that these trading partners had for Chinese products. The result, of course, is that the impact between these two economic zones as the Song period began in 960 was relatively minimal. So a couple of pictures just to sort of illustrate what we're looking at this point in time. So this is a map of some of the shipwrecks that are located in the Java Sea. And this wreck here, the Intan wreck in particular, dated to the early 10th century, just as the Song dynasty was about to sort of begin its dynastic period in China. What we find is that the primary cargo of these vessels, in terms of the Chinese commodities that it carried, were things like silver ingots that were sort of cast by the court officials, and these were official commodities. Also, bronze mirrors that date from the Han dynasty all the way to about the late Tang dynasty. About 200 of them were in this shipwreck. And so what we're looking at are very expensive bronze items as opposed to copper material. So the nature of exchange was highly ritualized, and the types of products that were exported by China and given to these trading partners are very, very specific in terms of their status and the types of products that we're looking at. Another example would be dated to the middle of the 11th century. So if we look at some of the court documents like the Song Hui Yao, for example, one of the things that we see is in terms of the textiles that are exchanged at the state level, exchanges were very, very specific. High value, silk products that were stipulated in terms of the rank of the people who were coming to sort of exchange products with the Song court. In return, depending on what your rank is and which state you represented, the silk products that were given to you in return for the Indian Ocean and Middle Eastern products that you brought were actually dictated based on the ranking of your state that you represented and the rank that you held as a trade representative. So very, very specific, and to some extent a very limited range of Chinese products that were permitted to be given in the nature of these sorts of relationships. In the case of China, the impact was very minimal. At this point in time, we're looking at around about only 5% of China's economy, primarily centered on maritime trade, particularly with Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. In Southeast Asia itself, the impact of Chinese trade was sort of centered in the port cities in coastal Southeast Asia and didn't really sort of extend into the hinterlands. So here, for example, is a map of a couple of excavation sites in South Kedah on the Malay Peninsula that's dated to about the 10th to the 12th centuries. And we're really looking at this. Thank you. Okay. We're looking at this site here, site number 32, Kuala Sungai Mas, which is dated to the 10th to the 12th centuries. Quite a number of Chinese ceramics and metalware were excavated here that date to the 10th to the 12th centuries, but 6 miles down, Site 31 has almost no Chinese commodities of the same period. So it's really sort of limited to the port city, and obviously for redistribution to the other ports in Southeast Asia, with very little impact, I think, in terms of the society and their consumption patterns beyond or inland from these port cities. So what happened? Towards the end of the 10th century, as the Song Court became stabilized over the 4 decades after 960 AD, a couple of changes began to occur in China's maritime trade. And this was premised on the Song Court's sort of initiative to shift maritime trade and foreign trade towards being devolved towards the international ports along its southern coastline. 2 processes in particular occurred over the course of the 11th century. The first one being the devolving of Chinese domestic trade in foreign products into private hands. The second process was a liberalization of Chinese shipping. These 2 processes were initiated primarily because of the geopolitical exigencies that the Song Court faced towards the northwest frontier into Central Asia at this point in time, and it sort of had to sort of find the resources to deal with those issues. But the result of it is that economically it had a ripple effect beyond Chinese borders southwards into places like the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. So what were these 2 processes? The first being the devolving of Chinese domestic trade in foreign products into private hands. Began about 982, where Chinese citizens were allowed to participate in the domestic trade in China of 37 foreign products. And there's a list of them. And as you look at the list, the main characteristic is that almost all of them were Southeast Asian products. So the Song Court sort of kept the prerogative of international trade within China itself in terms of the Middle Eastern and Indian Ocean products to itself, but it allowed Southeast Asian products to be freely traded by its citizens in 982. With the advent of the 11th century AD, a second occurrence took place over a 60-year period, and that was that customs duties and official compulsory rate purchases were progressively reduced by the Song Court over a 60-year period. By 1072, with the advent of the Wang Anshi reforms, the proportion of incoming foreign products that remain in official hands reduced to no more than 35%. And the proportion of 35% in state hands remained intact until about the end of the Song period. With the advent of the Mongol period in 1279, the Yuan dynasty, the proportion of incoming foreign products in official hands was further reduced to 6 and 2/3% of the imported commodities. What it does then, therefore, is that it provided a context for the Chinese domestic economy to develop a desire for products that foreign markets could offer. So that's a lot of information. So what does it mean? The most important line here really is this red line here. So as the Song dynasty begins, and over the course of the 11th century, what you actually see is some kind of an oscillation in terms of the proportion of all incoming foreign commodities that were allowed to be privately traded by the Chinese. This is within the domestic Chinese economy. So once the goods come in, right? The Song Court took a proportion of that and therefore obviously managed a proportion of their trade through two key means. One was the customs duties, and the other one being the compulsory purchases. So when a vessel arrives in China, once you have your harbor charges, which is your customs import duties, then what you have is the Song Court or the officials stipulating that a certain proportion of the remaining cargo will be compulsorily purchased by the state. Then the remainder of the cargo, which used to be completely under state control, over the course of the 11th century was allowed to be sort of filtered into the hands of private traders and then domestically traded. They had different proportions for different kinds of commodities. Low-value commodities, for example, had different proportions of the import duties and the compulsory purchase. High-value commodities, commodities that were rated as high value, also had different proportions. But the key thing is this, that by about the end of the 11th century, the proportion had sort of pretty much stabilized at about 65%. And in textual sources, the memorials that are sent up by officials from the ports to the central court at Kaifeng indicated that 65% was what the merchants were indicating was a good proportion because it allowed for a sufficiently high proportion of profitability. So 65 is actually a very important figure. Later on in the 12th century, some things had occurred. We'll get back to that in a while, but just remember the 65% proportion as an ideal sort of profitability level that traders domestically were thinking about in terms of the trade in foreign commodities. The second process that was occurring in the 11th century was the liberalization of Chinese shipping. So prior to 971, technically or officially, Chinese shipping was not allowed to operate outside of Chinese waters. But in 971, the Song Court allowed Chinese ships to go abroad if they did a very important administrative thing, and that was to register at two key ports, the port of Hangzhou or the port of Mingzhou. In 991, after the Song Court stabilized its political hold over South China, particularly the provinces of Fujian and Guangdong, it allowed a third port, Guangzhou, to actually register outgoing vessels, Chinese vessels that were outgoing into international waters. What is really interesting is that although this was allowed, the need to report at either one of these three ports before you sail out into international waters actually had a constraining effect on the development of shipping networks. A text that's dated to 1116, the Pingzhou Ketan, sort of records that traditionally traders were complaining that they had to do this because it added administrative costs and time to the sailing, the sailing patterns that they otherwise would have been able to sort of undertake. And so what you have was shipping sort of not really quite developing at an exponential rate, even though it was liberalized or it was open and it was allowed to occur after 971. About 100 years down the road, in 1087, an interesting thing occurred, and that was that the Song Court finally allowed a couple of South Chinese coastal ports to register outgoing vessels. So the number of ports that you could register your vessel before you left Chinese waters increased. And a couple of years down the road, in 1090, the Song Court allowed any coastal districts to register outgoing vessels as long as it was willing to take on that administrative responsibility. What it did was it opened the whole of the South Chinese coastline basically to shipping networks to be developed. There was one major restriction that the Song Court did impose, and there was a 9-month limitation to how long you could be out in beyond Chinese waters. So once you had registered and you sailed out, you had to be back within 9 months. If you didn't arrive back in the port of registration within 9 months and you were late, you had to explain why you were out there and why you were late. And if you didn't have a really good explanation, your entire cargo would be confiscated by the Chinese officials. So this limitation had an impact in terms of the nature of the shipping networks that were developed. But once 1090 occurred and the liberalization of Chinese shipping took place, it was never scaled back or restricted after that. So all the way through into the 14th century, Chinese vessels were basically free to sail to anywhere that they wanted as long as they came back within 9 months. And the result was that Chinese shipping capacity and networks developed exponentially as a result of that. So what is it about the liberalization of shipping that was so important? So these are all the key ports that we have by the sort of end of the 11th century in South China. They are quite specific in that there are really only about 5 of them here. So in terms of the shipping networks that could develop and branch out into places like, the Sea of Japan or Southeast Asia or the Indian Ocean, you really have not a huge amount of starting points, as it were, until 1090. And anywhere along this coastline, shipping networks could basically be developed. That was important because with the 9-month limitation, what ends up happening is that you actually can only go to very few places in maritime Asia. So if you were a vessel, for example, that was originating, say, here, Guangzhou, you wanted to come down to Southeast Asia, right, or the Indian Ocean, you had to wait till about November to February with the northeast monsoon flowing down in this direction so that you could actually head out into Southeast Asia. By the time you arrive here, which usually took about a month and a half, you were sort of, docked at a port along this area here, and then you would engage in trade. The monsoon patterns then begin to shift towards a southwest monsoon wind round about April to September, and it will go up in this direction. Now, if you wanted to sail from China into the Indian Ocean, you actually had to wait till April before you could do that, right? But if you did that and you headed towards the Bay of Bengal, it would take you another 9 months before you could go back to China. So you are basically in violation of the regulations. So what ended up happening with the 1090 liberalization is that Chinese shipping began to develop, but it really primarily focused in Southeast Asia or across in the Sea of Japan. These were the 2 main areas or economic zones that Chinese shipping began to sort of, pay their attention to and grow their networks into. So Southeast Asia then becomes, at the end of the 11th century, a very important maritime economic zone that the Chinese were basically trying to sort of, reach out into. The other thing that happens, of course, is that shipwreck data, if we look at the shipwrecks, for example, there is a third wreck that I didn't put here, which is the Baijiao wreck that's kind of located in this area here, which is dated to the end of the 12th century. But these are all the known wrecks from the 10th to the 14th century. And if you notice, the Chinese wrecks do not really sort of appear until around about the 12th century. So the archaeological data from shipwrecks in Southeast Asia indicate that actually the shipping networks do not develop until the end of the 11th century. So that's actually a very, very important development in terms of maritime trade, Chinese maritime trade into Southeast Asia. The vessels were very large. This is a Chenzhou wreck, but the Chinese have actually recently, in the last 10 years, found and has systematically excavated another wreck, which is known as the Nanhai No. 1 wreck, which was discovered in the Pearl River Delta about 10 years ago. They built a museum around it. It's dated to about 1160 AD, and the size is the same as this late 13th century shipwreck. About 30 meters long, so around about 90 feet long, by about 10, 11 meters wide, so about 30 feet wide. It had a displacement of roughly about 350 to 400 tons. So it's a significant amount of cargo that these vessels can carry. This one had 15 waterproof bulkheads. Each one is sort of a chamber on its own. So if this zone gets flooded, you could actually sort of seal it up so that the whole vessel does not sink. And then the other sort of bulkheads here would remain, relatively dry. So the nature of the navigational technology or shipbuilding technology was actually very, very advanced. This is not new. It wasn't because of the liberalization in 1090 that allowed this to happen. The Chinese had all these vessels ready already since sort of the 1st century AD. It's just that the policy that allowed them for outward sort of ocean-going sort of trips really sort of started around about the end of the 11th century, and it could carry a significant amount of cargo. The result of these two administrative sort of liberalization processes in terms of the maritime trade that China was experiencing may be sort of summed up by this figure, and that is that we see three sectors occurring. One is the Chinese domestic economy, where the coastal provinces, in terms of their consumption and economic output patterns, began to be projected outwards by the shipping networks into places like Southeast Asia. So, in other words, Southeast Asian trading partners not coming to the coastal ports of China and then receiving whatever they could and then going back to Southeast Asia. Chinese were actually bringing out their manufacturing capabilities into Southeast Asia by the end of the 11th century. At the same time, Chinese consumption tastes and patterns were also projected outwards in terms of the sourcing of foreign products that were available in Southeast Asia for Chinese consumption. The same thing occurred in the reverse direction as well. Southeast Asia was now, because of all the Chinese shipping that was coming out, beginning to sort of be able to sort of have a sense of what was available from the Chinese economy for their own consumption. But at the same time, in terms of the products that it could trade with China, because of the increasing shipping volume that was arriving in Southeast Asia itself, it was able to sort of project its own production capabilities into the Chinese economy. So this is actually an absolutely important development at the end of the 11th century. The effects were pretty fundamental. One of the things that occurred, obviously, is that we have trans-regional economic dependency beginning to be developed over the course of the 11th into the 14th century. With a diffuse shipping network and domestic participation in international trade, it connected the coastal hinterland of China with the international economy. And at the same time, the increasing intensity of knowledge of overseas markets, particularly in Southeast Asia itself, led to a projection of Chinese capabilities abroad as the unit cost of shipping began to decrease over time. As the unit cost of shipping began to decrease over time, the unit value of Chinese exports also decreased through the course of the 13th to 14th centuries. So instead of being sort of expensive items that are exported in the 10th century, by the 13th and 14th century, what you have is increasingly cheap items being exported out of China into Southeast Asia because the shipping volume is so large, right, that it made it profitable. But at the same time, the range and the variety was also very, very big. And this is evidenced by the development of export products, which we can see archaeologically in shipwreck data. In terms of finished products like ceramics, for example, textiles and metals, but also partially finished products such as foodstuffs, textiles, and iron bars. So if we look at a map like this, for example, which has all the kiln sites that were active in the province of Guangdong in the 10th to 14th century. Between the 10th to the 11th centuries, the main ceramic kilns that were producing ceramics for export into Southeast Asia are the ones that are located near the port city of Guangzhou. So these three, Sichuan, Nanhai, and Foshan in particular. White ceramics, whiteware ceramics that you can immediately identify came from these places. They're very, very close to the port city of Guangzhou. And so obviously, naturally, that was sort of, the manufacturing economy of the kilns nearby fed the international trade and then out into the international market in Southeast Asia. By the time you get to the 12th and 13th centuries, these ports begin to actually produce huge quantities. So Chao-An, for example, Meizhou, Yangjiang, these three ports outside of your Pearl River Delta area began to produce vast quantities of ceramics that begin to show up in Southeast Asia. And of course, that was the result of ships being able to sail out of anywhere along this coastline as long as they could register themselves with a district administration. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the export, this is the Namhai #1 wreck that's dated to the second half of the 12th century. The Chinese were hoping that they would put it in a fish tank, build a museum around it, and then they would do marine excavation, somewhat of a show and all that. And they realized that they couldn't do it after a little while because the mud kept sort of muddying the water, so nobody could see what was going on in the fish tank. And so the decision was made to drain the whole thing, which they did. And so now it's like a land excavation site. So this is the second season of excavations in this museum. So it's actually in the museum itself. You go to the museum in Guangdong, you can actually see that whole thing. It's basically a case, and they're excavating. But it gives you a sense of the scale of the production that we're looking at here. And all these were basically intended for the Southeast Asian market. Most of these products were not produced in any of the kilns near the port city of Guangzhou, but actually located further afield along the coastline of China. Same thing as well when we look at the picture in Fujian. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the kilns around this area here that's close to the port city of Guangzhou were the main producers of the ceramics that were exported from this part of coastal China. But by the 14th century, you get them appearing from Jiangpu, Tong'an, even Tehua as well. So basically the whole of the coastal provincial economy, right, was manufacturing, right, for the export market in Southeast Asia, as opposed to just the kilns that were located near to the port city. In terms of the textile export, we also see some interesting developments. Round about the beginning of the 13th century, the end of the 12th to the beginning of the 13th century, there was an interesting text that was written that's known as the Zhu Fan Zhi. Basically, it was a port superintendent who was located in the port city of Quanzhou, and he wrote, an account of all the different ports out in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean that they knew that the Chinese were basically involved in trade by this point in time, the shipping industry. And so he wrote down, the kinds of Chinese commodities that these foreign ports were interested in. And this is a reconstruction of that textile trade that was evident to him in Quanzhou at the beginning of the 13th century. Most of the textiles that he listed were fairly expensive textiles like brocade, for example, chiffon, damask. These are actually the most expensive Chinese textiles that you could get at that point in time. What is interesting is if you note the port city of Srivijaya here, he recorded that this was a port that was interested in 3 different kinds of textiles, right? Same thing as well when you look at Java. Down here, there was a port here as well, the port of Kediri, and they were interested in several different types of textiles. What it indicates, obviously, in the early 13th century, although the Chinese were going out to Southeast Asia already, unlike ceramics, they were still not really fully aware of the distributive patterns and the sub-regional tastes in Southeast Asia. So you had one port that would import several different kinds of textiles, and then obviously that port in Southeast Asia would then redistribute the different textiles to all the different sub-markets that it was aware of. Okay, that's the early 13th century. By the time you get to the mid-14th century, the number of incidences in terms of the high-value silks decreases. What you get instead is a tremendous knowledge of all these cheap silks that are exported from China into Southeast Asia. And the demand knowledge is very specific. So for example, these yellow dots here are basically silk textiles of a generic nature. And they were noted by the Chinese traders to have been demanded in this part of island Southeast Asia. If you think about these pink circles, for example, the red tabby weave silks, these are just very ordinary textiles, but they were dyed red. Chinese traders were aware that the southeast coast of the Isthmus of Kra or the Malay Peninsula was where most of these textiles were demanded. And on the other hand, if you think about these ones here, again, the color was different. So the knowledge by the middle of the 14th century of the Chinese textiles that were exported was actually very, very specific to the port level. So in other words, the level of knowledge that the Chinese traders had was actually quite detailed. and very, very specific. But the other thing that's really interesting, of course, is that silk exports were no longer the expensive silks, but had now become the cheaper or the cheap silks that were produced in South China. And so the value, the unit value of that trade of Chinese export declined as the volume of shipping increased. And I think that's one of the most important developments during this period of time. So another couple of photographs that I wanted to show, and this is a nod to Sanjo, who obviously loves shipwrecks. Chinese were also exporting other iron commodities or iron products, but they were very specific in terms of the type of iron products that they exported. So the 12th and 13th century, for example, in the shipwrecks that were found in Southeast Asia, you will always find huge piles of these things, right? These Chinese woks that were cast of iron, and they were very, very large piles. Each one will weigh a couple of tons, and where you have shipwrecks in Southeast Asia of this period, you will find things like that. So, and the Chinese were exporting cookware that were cast out of iron, and then exporting them out as finished products to island Southeast Asia, including the Malay region and the Malacca Straits. They also exported partially finished products, so products that were not complete as finished items, but they were sort of partially manufactured, and then you could do something else to it, value added. Along with woks will be all these piles of iron bars that look like that. They kind of look trapezoidal. The cross section is like a triangle. And what they were actually iron bars that would be exported to Southeast Asia, particularly the island of Java, where they would then continue to be beaten and processed, eventually becoming weapons. So in island Southeast Asia, iron is relatively sort of rare and deficient. There's only one place in island Southeast Asia where there's a significant amount of iron, that is South Sulawesi. Java, for example, the Malay Peninsula, and even Sumatra is somewhat iron deficient. And so it's much cheaper to import large quantities of Chinese iron and, sort of continue to process them into something like weapons, for example, than to try to produce it yourself. And that speaks to the, how cheap these items were coming out of China at this point in time, facilitated by Chinese shipping. We've done quite a lot of excavations in Singapore that's dated to the 14th century. And one of the things that we've found is that the proportion of storage jars, shirts, in any of the sites, any of the excavation sites in 14th century Singapore were quite similar. A large proportion of storage jars from Guangdong, and then a whole proliferation of ceramics from the province of Fujian. But each of these types, in terms of the percentages, are actually quite similar. And so this is a site that sort of, was functioning for about 100 years through the course of the 14th century. Had quite a lot of trade with Chinese traders. And the main thing about these ceramics is that they are actually storage jars. So some of them are pretty small, like this one, for example, around about 600 to 800 ml each. They're pretty standard in terms of the size. You can excavate like 1,000 of them. They all have pretty much the same capacity volume that they can carry. All of them were produced in South Fujian, very, very close to places which were producing glutinous rice, which was used for the production of rice wine. So a huge amount of alcohol was being exported over a 100-year period to places like Singapore. For example, it's like really drinking a lot there. Other things, including large jars, like these ones, for example, here. These ones here have very, very thin walls, but we've reconstructed some of them. They're about this big. So in terms of what goes in, lightweight, right, in terms of the density, but fairly voluminous. So it could be foodstuffs, dried vegetables. I mean, the list goes on. But what we are seeing is very specific and sustained demand, right, for foodstuffs and the products that were contained in these storage jars that were produced by the coastal and the provincial hinterlands along the coastline of China here, and exported out to Southeast Asia. And demand was very specific and sustained, and the proportions were pretty much the same over a 100-year period. So if we think about it, there were a significant amount of effects or the impact of changes in Chinese maritime trade policies on Southeast Asia as a result of the changing nature of Chinese shipping. One of the things that happens is that the economic region that encompassed South China and Southeast Asia, including the Malacca Straits region and the Malay region, began to integrate vertically. In the case of Chinese products, we see that, for example, in the foodstuffs and the iron bars that are evident in shipwrecks from the 12th and 13th centuries onwards. The other thing, of course, is that the reverse was also happening from Southeast Asia into China. One of the things that happens in the 12th century is this situation in 1164, where the Song Court decided out of the blue that the state proportion for the trade in luxury foreign products was going to be increased phenomenally to about 65%. So up until that point in time, so foreign products in the Song period are classified under three classifications: low value, high value, and luxury. Up until 1164, luxury items from about, from 1168 onwards were about 65% under private hands in the domestic trade in China. But in 1164, for ceremonial purposes, the Song Court decided that it would not allow the trade to remain in Chinese hands, private Chinese hands anymore. The luxury commodities that included, actually there were only 8 of them. Ivory is one, rhinoceros horns is another one, turtle carapaces, tortoise shell. So, items that basically had significant ritual significance to them as raw materials were retained under state hands at about 65% proportion in 1164. And the Chinese merchants complained about it. They said, we can't basically, have any kind of, realistic, profitable trade in these items if we only are going to be able to, have 35% of it, as it comes into the Chinese market. And so what they end up doing is shift their focus to looking at and concentrating in high-value commodities from Southeast Asia and low-value products from Southeast Asia. And that shift had a significant impact on the kinds of products that were then imported into the Chinese economy from 1164 onwards. The convergence of the Chinese domestic economy with Chinese shipping, on the one hand, projected Chinese sort of demand out into Southeast Asia. So the Chinese could now shop abroad. But the limitations on the trade in luxury goods within China itself also forced Chinese traders to basically concentrate only on primarily Southeast Asian products, including low-value commodities. So as the intensification of contact and knowledge of Chinese traders and what was available in Southeast Asia increased over the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, what you end up getting is a development of detailed knowledge of products and quality that's available for export. And I have to apologize because unlike Chinese manufactured items, which were highly inorganic, and obviously therefore remain fairly intact in terms of an archaeological context, for Southeast Asian products, the unfortunate thing obviously is that we're dealing primarily with organic material. And so, archaeologically, we don't really have a lot of, sort of remains. So what we have to depend on are the textual material and textual records in China pertaining to Southeast Asian imports during this period of time. And there were 3 types of economic integration that was occurring as a result of all these, sort of policy changes in the 12th century. The first one was what we call a product substitution. So by mid-12th century, what we were seeing is products from Southeast Asia that were really sort of superior quality substitutes for what was produced in China at that point in time. So anything from beeswax, for example, cane sugar, fiber mats, these were all low-value commodities. They were imported in. Lacquer wood is a very good example of that. It proliferates in Southeast Asia. It's very, very cheap. Used to be available in the first millennium AD in the subtropical zones of Guangdong and Guangxi in China. It was an aromatic wood, so it was used as an incense wood. But by the end of the first millennium AD, you had deforestation in South China, and so these things these plants were no longer available readily in subtropical China. So as the Chinese went out in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, they found this item obviously in the tropical zones of Southeast Asia and imported it. It was so cheap that The Zhu Fanzhi in the early 13th century by the superintendent of the port affairs in Quanzhou said, this product is very cheap, all right? And because of that, even the poor in China can afford it, all right? So it very specifically, it's a product substitution sort of process. By the early 13th century, you had a second process that was occurring, which was the importation of Southeast Asian products as raw materials in Chinese manufacturing. So incense wood, for example, were imported into China from the late 13th century onwards as ingredients for the manufacturing of jaw sticks. And what they would do is they would put a couple of different kinds of wood together, and based on the price of the different, aromatic woods and all that, the price of your jaw sticks would differ. So the quality was different, the aroma was different, the purpose for it was different, and so on and so forth. You also started to see materials for furniture making begin to appear in the Chinese market and exported from Southeast Asia into China, including things like rattan, for example, musk wood planks and camphor coated planks. So what it is a piece of wood, and musk is it's a derivative from an animal, right? It's an aromatic derivative of an animal. And they would basically coat the planks with this so that it would have a nice smell, all right? Same as well with camphor coated planks. Basically, they were just embellishments for the production of certain kinds of things, particularly chests for storage of textiles. By the 14th century, you had a further development of that, and that is that Southeast Asian products were beginning to affect material cultural development in China. So this is actually a step further. And furniture timbers, redwood, for example, garu wood timber and all that were beginning to be imported for the furniture making industry in China. Camphor, on the other hand, began to sort of feature as a medicinal ingredient that actually affected and caused the development of Chinese pediatrics, particularly for children with what we call gas problems, in their gastrointestinal systems and eye infections. They did not have any sort of treatment for that before the 12th century. By the 13th and 14th century, with camphor, they began to sort of develop these sort of treatments for children with these sorts of infections. So it's pretty interesting. It's no longer sort of import substitution, but it actually affects material culture, right? So just a few slides, one of which is this one. The shipwreck, which is known as the Quanzhou wreck, which is a Chinese vessel, which was found in the Bay of Quanzhou. It's dated to about 1270 to 78, through numismatic dating. Had a cargo that was completely intact when it was excavated in 1972. And the entire cargo is comprised of these things. Very low value products like betel nuts, for example, which had medicinal purposes. You chew it, it's like a chewing gum. And lacquer wood and garu wood, for the production of incense, obviously, in China. So the whole ship had nothing but low value commodities. In the 14th century, if we look at a text known as the Taoyi Zilier, which is dated to 1349, what we find is that if you compile, so it talks about 99 ports across the whole of maritime Asia, but if you actually look at the detailed information in that text, in terms of the products that were exported by some of these ports and the quality that they offered, so like this port, for example, offers this particular product at the middle quality or the high quality or the low quality, and you draw it on a map, what you find is that this trader who wrote this text really had very high familiarity with this part of Southeast Asia, because he knew where certain products could be found in the ports in this place and the quality that was involved. So they were actually concentrating and specializing in what we call sub-regions within Southeast Asia itself. By the middle of the 14th century, the knowledge was extremely detailed and high. And I have two pictures. The screen, I think the TV might be a better one. And that is Huanghua Li. This is what we call the yellow pear tree wood, the very, very well-known export of Hainan Island in the 16th century. and Thiam, which is basically purple incense, Tan being sort of sandalwood, right? But sandalwood is, as an aromatic, it's not a timber. You can't use it for construction. So this is actually a red wood or purple wood that is actually from certain parts of Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent as well. Now, why is this important? Because in the 14th century, furniture construction timbers began to be exported from Southeast Asia into China. If you actually think about furniture connoisseurship in the Chinese context, around about the 15th and 16th centuries when it actually develops. But the Chinese were particularly crazy not about the kind of furniture, like this is interesting because I actually noticed this when we walked in. The shapes, the form of the furniture was already developed by the Tang dynasty. So these are all old forms, okay? What was really interesting about the connoisseurship in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, the Middle Ming period, was actually the wood and the grain. And the appreciation of the grain of the wood and the color of the wood was what the connoisseurship was all about. And that actually has its beginnings in the import of timber from Southeast Asia in the 14th century. So basically what was happening was, aesthetics basically was being affected at the beginning in terms of the furniture appreciation or connoisseurship by Southeast Asian materials, which is a very, very interesting thing and very, very far away from what we call product import substitution. Right. The last point I want to make, and I'll make it very quickly because I'm running out of time, is the impact that economic integration across South China and Southeast Asia had on the geopolitics of Southeast Asia. The vertical economic integration created a situation whereby regional coastal polities in island Southeast Asia and the Malay region in particular began to decline because you no longer needed one representative from the region to go to China in order to trade, because the Chinese were all coming out on their own accord and in large numbers. So in the absence of an agrarian base in your economy, what ends up happening if you're highly dependent on trade is that the trade is very diffused. And so the regional sort of politics began to shift. And one of the things that we find is that before this economic integration began to occur in the late 11th and through into the 14th century, the Malacca Straits region was primarily sort of, commanded by a political entity that was centered in Palembang but had the ability to basically command and at least dictate the geopolitics of this region in this sort of large geographical zone. By the early 13th century, as more and more Chinese shipping and traders began to appear and be involved in the Southeast Asian economy, that broke up into three major components, which is here, here, and here, centered on the regional trading centers of Samudra and Lumbri up there, Palembang and and Jambi here, and Tambralinga up here in the Gulf of Siam. By the 14th century, with Chinese shipping and maritime trade being fully centered in Southeast Asia, these circles are gone, and what you have is basically a plethora of port cities, very, very small, each of them, and basically they are actually polities in their own right, but they have absolutely no sort of geopolitical sort of gravitas in this sub-region itself. So vertical economic integration had a significant impact on the nature of politics, geopolitics in Southeast Asia. The only ones that remain in, sort of regionally strong is Java, because it had a rice base basically on the island of Java as an agrarian economy. And if you put this is like my sad attempt at social science. This blue line basically, sort of indicates sort of the growth of regional politics or the decline of regional politics in the Malacca Straits region. It peaks round about here, which is the end of the 9th century. And this whole thing obviously is the Tang dynasty with the formalized sort of state-level exchanges. As Chinese trade begins to be increasingly liberalized and appear in Southeast Asia, what you get is a decline in the regional sort of geopolitical formation. And obviously this is the low point, right? Where Chinese trade is phenomenal and really sort of all-encompassing in the 14th century. Ibn Battuta, for example, says that from the Indian Ocean all the way to the coast of China, if you want to go anywhere, Chinese ships are the ones that you have to travel in. Okay, and that actually corresponds with the lowest level in terms of the geopolitics in the region. And it only goes back up when the Ming Dynasty starts and the Ming voyages begin. Okay, and that's where the ritualized trade and all that begins again under the Ming Dynasty. So the impact actually on geopolitics in Southeast Asia is very, very big, mainly because Southeast Asia becomes the economic hinterland of China. So to conclude, what we see in this shift is that from the 10th to the 14th century, there's a shift from two distinct economic zones to a vertically integrated trans-regional economy. What we do see also is the development of a core periphery relationship between Southeast Asia and China, particularly the maritime part of Southeast Asia and China. And that relationship is asymmetrical, although there are obviously clear mutual benefits there, but the relationship is definitely asymmetrical, almost along the line of what we think of as Wallersteinian kind of world economic system, where you have the core and you have the periphery, right? And of course, the implications of integration extends beyond the economy into things like geopolitics for Southeast Asia. So with that, I conclude. Thank you.